The Culture Secretary has blasted the BBC, arguing that audiences increasingly feel the corporation is failing to be impartial. This is Lucy Frazer, who today announced tougher scrutiny of the public broadcaster, with its website and social media channels to be policed by the regulator Ofcom to ensure balance. The reforms follow fierce criticism of the BBC's refusal to call Hamas terrorists and accusations of plugging an anti-Tory agenda. The corporation also has been slammed for offering a steady diet of, quote, woke bias, with a review finding prejudice in coverage over debates including race and gender. Now, last year, Ofcom received almost 1,000 complaints about BBC impartiality, accounting for nearly 40% of all grievances. That's a dramatic rise on the 600 it received in 2022. Tensions have been worsened by controversies over Gary Lineker, who's used social media to criticise the government's Rwanda policy, and comedian Ben Elton branding Rishi Sunak a mendacious, narcissistic sociopath on the corporation's flagship politics show. The Culture Secretary told talkTV it was time to ramp up scrutiny and bolster public trust in the broadcaster.
Public trust in one of our public institutions is really, really important. And you're right to say that some people think it's biased and they're frustrated with the complaints process. And that's why today we're publishing the midterm review. And what that will do will enhance the impartiality of the BBC and provide more independent scrutiny of the complaint system.
There's a lot to say on this. I mean, firstly, just Ben Elton's comments. Rishi Sunak is a mendacious, narcissistic sociopath. That's just a bright bloke putting three words together, right? I mean, it's nothing more than that. Yeah. There's no real in-depth analysis of that. I get it. He's a left-wing commit, blah, blah, blah. I think the BBC, I think they make mistakes rather than... I mean, there's quite a lot of high-profile, fairly right-wing people that run the BBC and sit in very prominent positions. And, of course, over Brexit, which is maybe the best example, where we saw 50% of people say it's biased for Remain and 50% says it's biased for leaving. And the usual extraction from that is they're probably doing something right if they get it right like that, because both parties think the same thing's happening. But when they get it wrong, they get it spectacularly wrong. The Hamas, the Israel thing was monumentally wrong. It was offensive. It was criminal journalism in many respects. It should never have got to that place. But I think when it makes mistakes, the problem with it is it does and should be highlighted more than others. It's the state-funded broadcasting.
It is the state-funded broadcaster. I think there's some interesting aspects here, because we mustn't confuse the ability for the BBC to have alternative voices. And inevitably, some of those voices, whether it's Ben Elton or various other commentators, they are going to have strong views, and you want them, because otherwise you, we, us, cannot form our views. However, it's the editorial line that they choose on how they report, where they report. For example, they seem to spend an awful lot of time in Gaza reporting on what's happening there, as opposed to other sides to talk about, well, why is this going on? As opposed to, of course, if you're a journalist looking at babies who are dying and people who are in terrible straits, is going to give a very skewed side of one story. And I think it's the editorial line that they take that concerns me. But in particular, we need to also widen the conversation out. Otherwise, it becomes too localised and too political, in the sense that the BBC is kind of operating 20 years ago, and it needs to be operating in a modern digital world. And when Lucy Frazer says there are 447 million people who watch the BBC every week from around the world, that's great. Why the heck is your and my licence fee money going to fund that output, which is fundamentally Great Britain PLC? Let's split the BBC up in terms of its funding, ensure that it has good editorial line, and make sure that we understand the difference between being biased and having different views.
The thing is, I think we can get a bit skewed here, because actually just under 1,000 complaints from 27 million licence fee payers is not really...
We've got a problem with your microphone, Esther.
Hang on a minute.
So your mic is not working at the moment. It means that Esther Krakue will be silenced until a man with a big spanner can come in and fix it.
I can agree with what Esther's going to say. I think that the BBC isn't actually biased. And we can talk about Gaza and them not wanting to call Hamas terrorists, but that's the same across the board. They're not going and calling people terrorists in another country. They're not reporting on Sudan and saying, well, these people are terrorists. That's not how it works. They follow their rule book to the letter. Whether you like it or not, they're doing exactly that. And Lucy Frazer saying there's an audience perception that the BBC is not sufficiently impartial. Well, I'm sorry, perception and reality are two very different things. Just because people feel something is not impartial doesn't make it so.
Hang on a minute,
As you say, Ian, there are people saying they are biased either way. Is there biased in favour of Gaza?
Okay.
Other people saying they're biased
Hang
in
on a
favour of
minute. In
Israel?
the past 5 years, they've only upheld 25 complaints of bias. That's pretty poor. With the refusal to call Hamas terrorist thing, what I feel is this kind of... They make a mistake, as Ian says, and then they kind of double down on it, and they don't feel very fleet of foot. They don't feel able to respond to things. It feels like a sort of juggernaut that isn't able to respond to public mood. And anyway, impartial means impartial. It doesn't mean left-leaning. And that's what you get.
I think the issue here is because we've already established that actually 27 million license fee payers, if only just under 1,000 of them are complaining, the BBC is doing something right. I think the issue the BBC has is it doesn't have a very good job of promoting its value because we live in a diverse media landscape. You have Netflix, you have Amazon, you have ITV, you have all these different news stations that you have to justify your existence. So when it does get it wrong, like not calling Hamas terrorists, that's when it's such a big deal. But actually, if we look at it, the BBC does a relatively good job. And I'm not saying that, you know, it's always going to have an easy job, but I think it feels like it's worse than it is because of the heightened political landscape that we live in.
Well, I think lots of people agree that they do some things really well. A lot of people would agree they do sport really well, that they do original drama really well, that they do like big public events, you know, the coronation, that kind of thing. They do that beautifully. But I think in terms of news and some coverage around the world, they do it really badly.
But do they also, I mean, it's a slightly different point, but it dovetails into the relevance of the BBC. I was, at the weekend, my little boy was watching Gladiators. I came in to watch a little bit of it with him. I was waiting for the ad break. I thought, where are the ad breaks? No ad breaks for this thing. And I found it's on the BBC. I thought, what are the BBC doing making Gladiators?
Well, making a format that's 20 years old.
Well, there's that, but also
and I know that they're there to entertain
for the commercial sector.
Well, actually, they're not there to entertain. I would be happy.
No, they are.
No, I'm sorry. I would be happy if the BBC got rid of Strictly and all these entertaining.
Sorry.
No. I'm sorry. If because the whole point of a public broadcaster is to inform the public and to adequately sort of clear out the bias that a lot of private media companies have. I don't need Strictly. Strictly doesn't inform me of anything.
Inform, educate,
I'm sorry,
and
I have
entertain.
Netflix to educate.
That was Lord
the BBC
Reed
should
200
get rid of
years
all
ago.
education.
He was right.
Sorry, no, it's
Okay,
goodness.
all right.